Beena Agarwal is Professor of Development Economics and the Environment at the University of Manchester and former Director of the Institute of Economic Growth at Delhi University. She's currently President of the International Society for Ecological Economics, at least I think you're currently that, and past President of the International Association for Feminist Economics, among many other positions in which she has served. She too is the author of numerous books, including Cold Hearths and Barren Slopes, which is on the fuelwood crisis in the Third World, and A Field of One's Own, which is on gender and land rights in South Asia. Her latest book, Gender and Green Governance, which is just out in paperback, I told her I would put that plug in, explores the impact of women's presence and women's absence in forest use and conservation efforts.
The reason I'm standing is because I'm shorter than all the men. I want to say firstly that it's really exciting to be here. The last time I was at a gathering like this was 18 years ago in Wageningen, when there was Peter Mollinger had organized a conference on agrarian questions, old and new. Many of us were here. There are many old friends here, many new ones, and I think it's, personally, I find it very exciting to be here. I haven't, is this? Oh, yes, of course, yeah. Yeah, can you hear me now? Because I'll, it'll take a second. Okay, thank you. For those of us who still believe in the transformative potential of the small peasant, and of farmers, the La Via Campesina vision of food sovereignty, I feel, has many compelling features. I mean, it talks of national self-sufficiency in food production, the rights of nations. It talks about local self-sufficiency, the rights of peoples. It talks about food diversity, organic farming, peasant control over food chains, over land, and it emphasizes social equality, consensus building, and democratic choice. And Paul also talks about, he's clarified it's not collective land ownership, but usufruct rights collectively. Now, yet these key elements of the food sovereignty vision present some critical contradictions, which I believe are difficult to resolve and reconcile. And I am going to talk about 5 of these contradictions. Firstly, between the goals of national and local food self-sufficiency, between promoting food crops organically and a farmer's right to choose whether to grow, what to grow, and how to grow it, between family farming and gender equality, between collective and individual rights of land ownership. Now, in my paper, I spell these out, but I also argue that some of the food sovereignty goals, I'll just use FS for short, I agree with Jim on that, could be better achieved through innovative institutional change without sacrificing the individual's freedom to choose. And broadly, I won't go into this. This is the broad structure of the paper. You could read it. But let me begin by the issue of shifting definitions. Now, in 1996, the first definition, they mooted the concept, the movement mooted the concept of food sovereignty and focused on national self-sufficiency and food diversity. In 2002, the definition broadened to include the rights of people to define their own food and agricultural systems, to be self-sufficient, but to the extent to which they want to be self-reliant. And then we have this major declaration in 2007, which broadens it and becomes all-encompassing. It embraces everyone in the food chain, producers, consumers, distributors. It adds to it the right to manage land, peasant empowerment, family farming, and gender equality, other forms of equality also. Now, the 1997 definition of food sovereignty, namely nation states seeking to be self-reliant to the extent possible, I believe has relevance in the wake of the 2007-8 food crisis. and the overdependence of many southern countries on others, especially northern ones, for their food security. Although the balance of imports and home production would need to be worked out. But how would you operationalize this 2007 definition? If farmers, due to their constraints and priorities, choose options which are contrary to the vision, whereas limiting their choices would go against the principle of the right to choose that the Declaration forefronts. The issue of gender equality or inequality, of course, is especially complex, and it would be difficult to address, I believe, within the individual family farming to which the movement gives primacy. Perhaps we need to explore alternative institutional forms which are based on farmer cooperation. Those could perhaps provide answers, but these would go contrary to the primacy of family farming. So let me elaborate. Firstly, the rights of nations. Now, we know that the 2007-8 spike in food prices dramatically brought global attention to food security. And we know that the poor, and especially women of poor households, were the worst affected. But these price rise and price volatility has not gone away. They remain major concerns globally. Now, an important factor underlying the price rise was the regional concentration of food grain production and exports. And even if you take the three proletariat crops that Jim talked about, over 80% of rice exports came from a few countries in Asia. In 2008, Thailand, Vietnam, India, and Pakistan, plus the USA. 85% of wheat exports came from 4 regions: North America, Russia, Europe, and Australia, and 65% of these 3 proletariat crops, the exports came from North America and Europe. And this gives you, shows it much more dramatically, that this regional concentration makes food deficit countries, all in the South, over-dependent on a few countries, mostly in the North. And it leaves them vulnerable to the vagaries of policy shifts in these countries. So, for instance, if the food exporting countries, the food prices will rise and fall. If exporting countries shift large areas from food to biodiversity, as for instance the United States has been doing, or if it cuts its export, or if it manages its agriculture inefficiently, or it fails to stop speculative hoarding, and adverse weather conditions can add to this. Now, these were, of course, also some of the primary factors in the 2007-8 food crisis. And in the long run, we must factor in climate change, which is expected to particularly affect South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. These are also the regions where the world's poorest live. And then there is the 9 billion expected in 2050. Now, in this kind of scenario, the La Via Campesina's argument that it is the right of each nation, and especially of the deficit nations, to seek food self-sufficiency resonates. But in practice, of course, not every nation can be self-sufficient, given that there are land and other limits. Nor is it clear how small farmers, given their constraints, can produce enough to feed themselves and provide for landless rural populations and the cities. So this brings me to my third point, which is the small farmer and her constraints. Now, the majority of farmers in developing countries are small, often marginal, and increasingly women. Cultivating under 2 hectares in small parcels, most are trapped in low productivity cycles and are not in a position to establish local food self-sufficiency. And this trap is gendered, given women's disproportionate dependence on agriculture for a living. So, for instance, in Africa, in 2008, 63% of female workers relative to 48% of male workers depended on agriculture. For Asia, the percentages were 57 and 48 respectively. Also globally, if you look at these graphs, except in Europe, women workers have been rising as a percentage of total agricultural workforce, as more men than women move out of agriculture into non-farm jobs. So in effect, we are seeing the feminization of agriculture. And in the world's major rice-producing and exporting areas of the South, almost half the workforce, and sometimes more, is female. Same is true in Africa. Now, small farmers and especially women thus have a central role to play in reviving agriculture, dealing with climate change, but they also face substantial constraints: insecure land rights, no assured water supply, limited access to credit, inputs, technology, information on new practices, and marketing infrastructure. Women face additional limitations on all these counts. So it's perhaps not surprising that of some 22 studies on sub-Saharan Africa that I'd looked at, and these measured the relative productivity of male farmers and female farmers, that in most cases, women farmers had lower yields than male farmers. At the same time, according to estimates such as the FAO's 2011 Food and Agricultural Report, women farmers, if they had the same access as men to inputs and services, their crop yields could be raised by 20 to 30%. So what does this imply for the food sovereignty discussion? First, for increasing national food outputs based on small farms, most developing countries require serious efforts to help farmers overcome these constraints. Secondly, although the food sovereignty movement recognizes women's roles and rights, and Paul said that eloquently, roles and rights in food production, it also gives central stage to family farming, where often women work as unpaid labor and without autonomy or equality. Also, given the feminization of agriculture, many family farms are effectively run by women, but most have no direct rights over the land or other assets. Now, the problems that women farmers face are structural and deep-rooted and need to be addressed specifically. It could include redistribution of productive assets within households and directing state services and civil society services to women. Now, institutional innovations involving only women rather than entire families, as I'll just discuss, also hold gains, but it requires a much more complex approach to production, to gender, and to the state than we find in the Via Campesina elaborations. Overall, the vision focuses on farmers' rights to do and not to their ability to do. Moreover, national self-reliance in food depends not only on overcoming small farmer production constraints, it also depends on what farmers choose to do. So the next part, I'm going to talk about the right of democratic choice. Now, the 2002 definition allows individual choice for people to become self-sufficient to the extent they wish to be. But in 2007, we shift to collective processes of democratic deliberation and consensus building. Now, of course, democratic deliberation, we'll all agree with, is extremely important. But what if a significant proportion choose otherwise? Do they have the democratic right to choose what they have reason to value? So suppose we take India. In 2003, there was a nationwide survey of some 51,000 farmers, that is 2.86 million people. And it found that 40% just did not like farming, especially because of low productivity and risk. Given a choice, they would prefer another occupation. Now, those disliking farming operated much smaller plots on average than those liking it. They were less likely to be aware of government incentives, minimum support prices, have crop insurance, be a member of a farmers' organization, know about biofertilizers, or belong to households where at least one member was a graduate. In short, they were much more vulnerable and resource poor than farmers who liked agriculture. Now, beyond this survey, there's also evidence on work that I'm currently doing on the difficulties farmers face if they don't want to cultivate food crops. So, for instance, I'm looking at women's group farming in two regions of India. And I found that in a number of cases, the groups had stopped cultivating collectively. And an important reason they gave was the mandate of the local NGO, which had catalyzed these groups, that the women should grow food crops to enhance household food security, which is similar to the food sovereignty argument. But food crops often fail under drought conditions. The women wanted to grow cotton, And so here's what they have to say. This is just some examples of many cases. So in the first case, we want more profits from agriculture. The NGO staff has restricted us to food crops only. Because there were no rains for 3 years running, we only cultivated pulses in 2 acres. We got no yield. Then we decided to do individual farming with cotton, which gives us a profit even when the rains fail. And so on. Now, shouldn't these women have a choice? There's also a popular assumption that women prefer food crops, but there's plenty of evidence that this assumption is misplaced. Also, local food self-sufficiency is not a necessary condition for food security. For landless rural workers, for urban dwellers, buying food, getting a living wage is very important. And of course, as we know, I mean, the examples, whether it's raspberry or anything else, I would say millets, which is neither proletariat nor is it petit bourgeois. We need much more than all of these for nutritional security. It's also notable that in the hundreds of farmers that we've been, my team has interviewed in India over these last year, almost none want their children to go into farming. Similarly, there's the issue of non-chemical farming, which I absolutely agree is very desirable for environmental health and for human health. But it's again complex and not everyone's choice. So choosing not to farm for self-sufficiency, choosing not to grow food crops, choosing not to grow organically, these are all democratic choices. And the food sovereignty approach emphasizes horizontal interactions, but paradoxically, farmers with equal say may go their own way. Now, the final part of what I want to say is that consider now the issue of collective versus individual rights. And Paul's clarified it, but there is still a notion of collective usufruct rights. There is a tension here. Can this tension between individual and collective be resolved? I believe it is by promoting voluntary resource pooling for production without forfeiting individual ownership. But the institutional forms I discuss are a far cry from the idea of collective ownership of land. They also involve moving away from family farming. Now, I talk about a group approach. It's something I'm doing currently research on. And there are many possible potential advantages of collecting as a group, both economic advantages and empowering peasants so that they can resist land grabs and all the sorts of things that we've been talking about, and particularly for women farmers. Now, this is not a utopian because, in fact, there are many examples of group farming where people pool their resources and cultivate. And I'll give you examples of 3. One is in Central Asia. What was interesting is that post-collectivization in many of these countries, Kyrgyzstan, Romania, and East Germany, they voluntarily pooled their land. They had a choice of going individual family farming. And what they did was they pooled their resources because they were short of capital or labor with relatives and neighbors, and this helped them overcome these shortages. And there were some studies in 10 years ago which showed that they were much more productive than individual family farms. In South Asia, there is a different kind of model of only women farming in Andhra Pradesh and Kerala. There's the very old model of the Deccan Development Society. Many of you know because its founder, P.V. Satish, has been part of the food sovereignty movement. But these are examples where women's groups come together, they lease in land jointly and jointly cultivate them. And I don't have time to go into it. They are in the paper. But many of these are cases which are currently active. And I'll just give you an example from Kerala, because I've already talked about Andhra. This is an example from DDS, Women Preserving Seeds, but they're part of the women's group. And I wanted to show you this, that typically you see women bending double always over the field, or you have traditional preparation of the field, and down below you have a women's group farm using modern technology, standing up straight, and so on. So there are several points which are important in these examples. They're also marketing their wares. One is these are institutional means of overcoming resource constraints. You don't forfeit owned land. Farmers keep their individual rights but farm collectively. Many want to grow non-food crops for better returns. For them, food security is the same, is equal to higher incomes and not just growing all that they need. Inter-family cooperation provides no clear mechanism of overcoming gender inequalities within the family. Non-family groups, however, could provide a basis for women's empowerment outside the family structure, which is not to leave families, but to provide mechanisms for empowering them. And I believe these examples arise not from a global vision of what peasant economies should do or be, they arose from local visions and institutional support systems. So I want to conclude, I'll take 30 seconds, that this vision of food sovereignty is a very attractive vision, but national food self-sufficiency goals would need to reduce over-dependency on imports, and we all agree with that. But we also need to overcome small farmer constraints, and here group approaches could provide an alternative. These are all points I've already made. I just want to leave with some questions that when we talk about global visions of representation, who represents the many, by what processes are decisions taken, can institutions that promote voice and choice ensure individual freedom while defining collective responsibility? So I began with a range of questions, and I leave you with some more. Thank you.